Blue is a colour that is often seen as a sign of stability and reliability. If you asked a kid in the 90s which video game company was the best, a lot of people would say Sega. If you ask the same thing today, you would get very different results. Blue is also a colour that can create feelings of sadness and loneliness. This is the story of the Sega Dreamcast. In 1989, the Sega Genesis was released during the 4th generation of video game consoles. The console was a massive success for Sega and acted as a genuine threat towards Nintendo, who were untouchable at the time. Sega's mascot Sonic debuted on this system, and the game was eventually included with every Genesis. Sega didn't have a lot of third-party support to start off with, as the other game developers were making games for Nintendo's console. This resulted in the first-party games of the Sega Genesis always being of very high standard, as they had to make great games themselves for people to buy their console. Part of the success of the system was due to its great marketing in North America. The console had an aggressive marketing strategy that showed off how the system was better than Nintendo's. The Sega Genesis was marketed as the more mature and cooler console to own. For example, Mortal Kombat on the SNES didn't have blood, but this was a different case on the Genesis. The Genesis outsold the SNES for 4 consecutive Christmas seasons in North America, partly due to its lower price point. The arcade ports were particularly great on this console, which gave another reason to get a Genesis. In the end, the Sega Genesis sold an impressive 30.75 million units worldwide, compared to their previous system, the Master System, only selling 13 million. Although the SNES ended up selling more, this generation proved that you didn't have to be named Nintendo to be successful in the gaming industry. Great games, great marketing and great arcade ports resulted in not only some of the greatest 2D games ever made, but also one of the best consoles of all time. For the 5th generation of consoles, Sega decided to release their next system, the Sega Saturn, in 1995 in North America. The upcoming Sony PlayStation was reported to be very powerful and capable of 3D graphics. Sega realised that a single CPU for the Saturn would not be enough to properly have 3D games and compete with Sony, so they decided to include another processor. This unfortunately made the Saturn hard to develop for, and most game studios did not know how to utilise the extra power. This resulted in many of the 3D Saturn games struggling to even hit 30 frames per second. Sega planned to release the Saturn on Saturday the 2nd of September 1995. However, they decided in short notice to release the console several months early to combat the release of the upcoming Sony PlayStation. The surprise release annoyed retailers as Sega didn't tell companies such as Best Buy and Walmart about their decision. The early release also annoyed game developers as they did not have enough time to finish their games for the early release of the system. The unfinished games were forced to be released anyway, and the games received poor reviews because they did not run well. As stated before, Sega was known for having great arcade ports, but this reputation was tarnished on the Saturn. The console's hardware was very complex, resulting in games being very hard to make. Most developers went over to the Sony PlayStation, as that console was much easier to develop games for. The Saturn was also distributed very poorly for the whole of its life, meaning that it was always hard to find one. Some Sega fans who grew up with the Genesis didn't even know the Sega Saturn existed until many years later.
I can't believe I missed an entire console. I mean, this isn't a damn add-on. This is an entire console I had never heard of, and I never picked up, I never checked out, I never knew anyone with it.
It also didn't help Sega that the PlayStation would sell for $100 less than the Saturn. This forced Sega to lower their price even though the Saturn was very expensive to make, which in turn partly caused financial problems for Sega. Sega also lost trust with some consumers. An add-on for their previous system, the Sega Genesis, was called the 32X. It costed $160 back in 1994 and was meant to increase the power of the Genesis and act like a next generation experience. The issue was that they released this add-on around the same time they released the Sega Saturn.
You're really crazy.
Don't you ever say that to me. Don't you ever say that to me again!
Nobody knew which one to buy, and the 32X was discontinued after 2 years. After wasting money on the 32X, people were unlikely to buy the Sega Saturn as they had lost faith in Sega. Nintendo wouldn't release their next generation console until late 1996 in North America, so because of all of these reasons, the PlayStation was a massive success. By August 1997, the new games developer Sony controlled 47% of the market, not bad for a newcomer. Nintendo controlled 40%, which was bad enough considering how big they were once before, and Sega controlled only 12%. One of the most shocking things about the Sega Saturn was that there was not a new 3D Sonic platformer for the console. Sonic is one of the most iconic video game characters of all time, and is one of the first things you think about when you think of Sega. Bernie Stolar was the president and chief operating officer at Sega of America. In 1997, he infamously stated, "The Saturn is not our future."
You what?
This was a terrible thing to say considering the console had only been out for 2 years. This statement was the nail in the coffin for the Sega Saturn. Although it was a decent success in Japan, the Sega Saturn ended up only selling 9.26 million units worldwide, a far cry from the 30.75 million units from their previous console. Nintendo's 5th generation console, the Nintendo 64, sold over 3 times this amount, and Sony's PlayStation crushed the competition and sold 102.49 million units worldwide. In 1998, the Sega Saturn was discontinued in North America and Europe, resulting in a whole year without new Sega Saturn games. Sega was in serious trouble and had to do something about it. In 1995, reports of a 64-bit Sega Saturn successor or add-on were being made. Because the Saturn failed, Sega decided to create a whole new console to kickstart the 6th generation of video game consoles. The hardware of Sega's next system would be similar to PCs that were being made at the time, resulting in their new console, the Dreamcast, being much cheaper to make. This also made the console much easier to develop for than the Sega Saturn. Sega also decided to include a modem with every Dreamcast, making the console have the ability to play online and access the internet, something that was very new at the time. Sega also had a keyboard and mouse accessory for accessing the internet. The Dreamcast logo was a swirl that was a different colour for each region. The swirl was orange for Japan and North America, but blue for Europe. The swirl change for European consoles was blue instead of orange due to a copyright, as a German game studio had a similar logo. Because the Saturn ruined Sega's reputation, Sega wanted to remove its name from the Dreamcast entirely, but they decided against it, and Sega's logo is still found on the Dreamcast. Sega spent $50 to $80 million on developing the Dreamcast, $150 to $200 million on software development, and $300 million on marketing the console. Sega really put everything into this console. It couldn't fail. The marketing for the system was extremely good at hyping up people for the console. In the UK, Dreamcast adverts appeared constantly before one of the biggest films at the time, Star Wars Episode I: The Phantom Menace. Sega also sponsored 4 European football clubs, including Arsenal.
Through the defenders as if they're not there. And the goalkeeper! What a sensational goal from Thierry Henry! He is just unstoppable!
In North America, the console had a marketing push of $99.99, signifying that the console would be released on the 9th of September 1999. They also had an It's Thinking ad campaign of television commercials. These commercials were used to emphasise the Dreamcast's hardware power. According to Peter Moore, the former president of Sega said, "We needed to create something that would really intrigue consumers, somewhat apologise for the past, but invoke all the things we loved about Sega, primarily from the Genesis days." Like the UK advertising, this marketing was everywhere. Because of these factors, the Sega Dreamcast gained a lot of interest. This was night and day compared to the Saturn's launch, which was messy and garnered very little interest. It was obvious that Sega had a clear vision with their new console, and learned from their mistakes from their previous system. The Dreamcast had a very unique memory card called the Visual Memory Unit, or VMU for short. The memory card had an LCD display, which acted as a second screen. It could tell you important information such as how much ammo you had left in a game. The Dreamcast itself didn't have memory card slots, rather you would plug it into the Dreamcast controller. The VMU also acted as a handheld gaming console and had a D-pad and buttons. You could connect one VMU to the other and play multiplayer games together. At the same time as the VMU, you could also connect other peripherals to the controller. Sega also made a rumble pack and a microphone for it. The Dreamcast also had fantastic video quality for the time, as the console supported 480p 60fps through a VGA cable. The technology Sega used in their arcade boards was very similar to the technology of the Dreamcast. This made it very easy to port nearly identical arcade games to the system. Many arcade games were eventually ported to the Dreamcast, such as Marvel vs. Capcom 2, Dead or Alive 2, and Crazy Taxi. Sega also planned to bring back successful franchises from the Genesis, such as Echo the Dolphin. Sega also encouraged developers working for them to experiment with more unique gaming experiences. This caused games such as Rez, Typing of the Dead, and Seaman to be made. Seaman was in particular innovative, being a pet simulator game where players would use a microphone to interact with the fish that grew up over time. Sega hoped that Shenmue would be very successful, and the reason to buy a Dreamcast. Shenmue was an open-world action-adventure game, which had a level of detail considered unprecedented for a video game. The game was considered to be extremely innovative and ahead of its time. Shenmue was reported to have cost Sega over $50 million to make, and became one of the most expensive video games ever made. Sega would also have a brand new Sonic game available for the launch of the Dreamcast, which was again seriously lacking in the Saturn. Before the console was even released, Sega had a big issue with the largest third-party video game publisher at the time, EA. During the time the Sega Genesis was relevant, EA released many sports games on the system which were highly regarded and sold really well. Unfortunately, EA did not develop games for the Dreamcast. EA claimed that because Sega changed their plans for the Dreamcast so much, like whether to include a modem or not, EA did not want the hassle of making games for them. The Dreamcast became the system that EA developers wanted to work on the least in the history of consoles at EA. EA Chief Creative Officer Bing Gordon said, "In the end, it felt like Sega was not acting like a competent hardware company." Sega claimed that EA wanted to have exclusive rights to be the only sports brand on the Dreamcast, but they could not accept that because of Sega's recent $10 million purchase of sports game developer Visual Concepts. The Dreamcast had many pre-orders for the console, but due to a shortage in one of the chipsets, Sega could not ship all the units they planned to initially. Because more than half of its limited stock had been pre-ordered, Sega had to stop pre-orders in Japan. On the 27th of November 1998, the Dreamcast was launched in Japan, and the entire stock sold out by the end of the day. Sega estimated that they could have sold an additional 200 to 300,000 Dreamcast units if they had enough supply. Only 4 games were available at launch, including an arcade port of Virtua Fighter 3. This game was very well received, and helped gain the reputation back of Sega creating great ports of arcade titles. Games like Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally Championship 2 were actually delayed for a few weeks instead of being released on the day. This wasn't ideal, but it was far better than releasing the games unfinished like they did with the Sega Saturn. Sega hoped to sell over 1 million Dreamcasts in Japan by February of 1999, but less than 900,000 were sold. Sega was trying to build an install base before other competitors like Sony would release their new consoles, but they fell short in their targets. There were some reports of disappointed Japanese consumers returning their Dreamcasts and using the refund to buy more PlayStation software. Before the console was even released in North America, Japan reduced the price of the Dreamcast, which made the hardware unprofitable again like the Saturn, but in turn it increased sales. Sega wanted a more successful launch in North America and wanted a minimum of 15 launch games. Sega managed to repair their relationship with US retailers, and the Dreamcast had pre-sold 300,000 units. The Dreamcast was launched on the 9th of September 1999. Sega sold 225,132 Dreamcast units in 24 hours, which the president of Sega of America at the time, Peter Moore, called the biggest 24 hours in entertainment retail history. In 2 weeks in the US, 500,000 Dreamcasts were sold, and by the 4th of November, over 1 million were sold. The Dreamcast was released in Europe on the 14th of October 1999. By Christmas of 1999, Sega of Europe had sold 500,000 units, placing it 6 months ahead of schedule. The rapid sales did not last, and only 1 million Dreamcasts were sold by the October of next year. Overall, the launch of the Dreamcast was successful, and a much better start to the console than the Saturn. Sony still had 60% of the video game market share in North America with the PlayStation at the end of 1999. Sony revealed its next generation console, the PlayStation 2, that was apparently going to be extremely powerful, much more than the Dreamcast, which built up a lot of hype for consumers. The console was also going to use the DVD-ROM format, which could store a lot more data than the Dreamcast proprietary GD-ROM format. Another reason why this was a brilliant choice by Sony was because at this point in time DVD technology was new and expensive, and getting a PlayStation 2 would be a great way to get a DVD player and a new console for an affordable price. Not only this, but the PlayStation 2 would be backwards compatible with almost every PlayStation game ever released. These factors would have made upgrading from a PlayStation to a PlayStation 2 a no-brainer. The specifications of the PlayStation 2 seemed to make the Dreamcast seem obsolete straight away, although reports were found that the PlayStation 2 was not as powerful as expected. The PlayStation 2 was planned to be released in 2000 for every region. Around this time, Nintendo announced their next generation console, and Microsoft started developing their own console. Sega's initial success didn't last in the US, as although the Dreamcast sales were over 1.5 million by the end of 1999, the console began to decline at the start of 2000. Poor Japanese sales partly caused Sega's 42.88 billion yen net loss, marking Sega's third consecutive annual loss. Although the momentum for the US and European sales slowed down, Sega's overall sales increased. Sega was not making a profit, however, due to the amount of money it costed to make and market the system. Due to poor market conditions, Sega's arcade business was affected too, causing 246 locations to close in Japan. Because of these reasons, Sega of Japan's developers focused on the US market to prepare for the launch of the PlayStation 2. To try and increase sales, Sega dropped the price of the Dreamcast from $199 to $149, and gave back the price of a Dreamcast and a free Dreamcast keyboard with every 18th month Sega Net subscription purchased. This was an okay idea on paper, but this caused even more financial losses for Sega. The Dreamcast would have had to sell 5 million units in the US by the end of 2000 to be able to continue, but Sega only ended up selling 3 million units. Sega expected to have a profit, but by September 2000, Sega projected a year-end loss of 23.6 billion yen. By March 2001, Sega had a net loss of 51.7 billion yen, which was $417.5 million. The launch of the PlayStation 2 in the US had a lot of shortages, but this did not help Sega, as many consumers waited for the PlayStation 2 to be available. The PS1, a newer, smaller version of the original PlayStation, was the best-selling console in the US at the start of the 2000 holiday season. Sony had 50% of the US video game market, Nintendo had 35%, and Sega only had 15%. Games such as Sonic Adventure, NFL 2K, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and Crazy Taxi were well received and sold well, but it wasn't enough to save the Dreamcast. Even Shenmue became one of the best-selling games on the system, but it was considered a commercial failure. As stated before, Shenmue was one of the most expensive games ever made. Every Dreamcast owner would have had to buy Shenmue twice for the game to make a profit. Okawa became the president of Sega on the 22nd of May 2000. Okawa had said for a while that Sega should abandon the console business. The co-founder of Sega, David Rosen, had always felt it was a bit folly for them to be limiting their potential to Sega hardware. Bernie Stolar had previously suggested that Sega should have sold their company to Microsoft. The Sega Japanese executives and the heads of the company's major Japanese game development studios had a meeting in September 2000. Peter Moore and Charles Belfield advised Sega to abandon the console business and focus on creating games for other systems. This advice caused the studio heads to walk out of the meeting. On the 31st of January 2001, Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast after the 31st of March, and to become a third-party developer for other platforms. This decision was by Peter Moore. Sega also reduced the Dreamcast price in North America to $99 to sell its unsold inventory estimated at 930,000 units. Further reductions to the price of the system came, until the Dreamcast was eventually sold for only $49.95. The final Dreamcast was autographed by the heads of all 9 Sega's internal development studios. Okawa, the president of Sega, loaned the company $500 million of his own money to keep the Dreamcast afloat. Okawa died on the 16th of March 2001. Before he died, he forgave Sega's debts to him, and returned his $695 million worth of Sega and CSK stock, which helped the company survive the transition to a third-party game developer. Okawa is remembered as an iconic part of Sega's history, and in some ways, his name marked the death of Sega as we knew it. In the end, the Sega Dreamcast ended up selling 9.13 million units worldwide, selling less than even the Sega Saturn. Sega really did try with the Dreamcast, but the damage was already done, and consumers did not have much faith in Sega. The PlayStation 2 ended up becoming the best-selling console of all time with 155 million units sold. You could blame PlayStation for the demise of the Dreamcast, but I think Sega did that themselves. If the Genesis add-on, the 32X, was never released, and the Saturn was planned as good as the Dreamcast was, the original PlayStation would have had a much tougher time in the 5th generation of video game consoles. Lack of support from big third-party game developers such as Squaresoft and EA also did not help the system survive. Sega's focus on hardcore gamers and not the mainstream consumer is also attributed to the failure of the Dreamcast.
I'll probably get wrapped in the mouth for this, but I think it was the last true gamers console. And what I mean by that is, it was a console that was developed for you. For you, the one watching this video. It was made for you. It was not made for your cousin who's casual and only likes Madden and Call of Duty. It was not made for your aunt who likes Wii bowling. You know, it wasn't made for that kind of market. It was made specifically and targeted exactly towards you, a person who is passionate about games, a person who cares about games, wants good gameplay and good stories, and really gets involved in those type of, well, most of the world would consider a very niche kind of hobby. Unfortunately, that's probably what killed it, is because it couldn't appeal to enough people.
A lot of video game consoles these days have been more about the additional features it can bring, and not the games itself. The disaster that was the Xbox One announcement received a lot of backlash due to the focus being barely on video games, and more on it being an all-in-one entertainment device. The public unveiling of the console took over 30 minutes before any video game was shown.
TV, watch TV, TV remote, TV experience, TV, sports TV. Anybody? TV, MTV.
A lot of consoles and game companies nowadays don't take a lot of risks, resulting in consumers being bored and disappointed with the games being released. Sega messed up big time, but you could always respect them for trying out new things. Sometimes this didn't work out for them, but when it did, you knew it was going to be something special. In retrospective, the Dreamcast was considered ahead of its time and is considered by many to be one of the greatest consoles ever made. The console was powerful for its time, had amazing arcade ports, and was easy to develop for. The Dreamcast still has new games created for it. The system has a big indie scene and has new independent games released for it every year. The Dreamcast was indeed a very special console, and deserved much better.